after he left the theater? Where'd he go?
He rode up on his horse to,
He crossed what?
no, I'm looking for it.
Okay, go ahead there, Branson, you got her. Yeah, right away after the shooting, he crossed the Potomac River and he left for Washington, D.C. Okay, Logan, who'd he hook up with once he got out of Washington, D.C.?
Was it Edwin Stanton?
No, he's the Secretary of War. That's the last, he's the one that set out the $100,000 reward. He wouldn't meet up with him.
David Carroll?
David Harold. So he met up with David Harold a few miles south of the capital in the state of Maryland, remember? And where did they go? Anybody? Where'd they go?
Tavern in Virginia.
That was owned by, or leased by, Mary Surratt. Very good. So the two men went to the tavern in Virginia that was leased by Mary Surratt. That's where they had met to put together their kidnapping and later assassination plots. And Jamie, what did Booth do before he left the tavern?
Told the bartender, killed him.
Yeah, he told the bartender that he killed Abraham Lincoln. Well, back in Washington, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton ordered the manhunt of Booth, and he offered a $100,000 reward, which would be about $1.5 million in today's currency, for his reward. And we showed you the original poster on Pawn Stars and how much it ended up going for. Or what did he want for it? The minimum he'd take was $150,000, but the value was $180,000. There's only 4 in the world today that survived. And they had some guy had one, and Rick tried to buy it on Pawn Stars. We watched it the other day for. He tried to buy it a lot cheaper, but the bottom price he would sell it for was $150,000 framed, and he really thought it was worth $180,000.
How much did
He offered Booth. They offered a $100,000 reward for Booth's capture, which would be about $1.5 million today. Now, what did Stanton? Anybody remember what I said about what Stanton think this might be? What did Edwin Stanton? Confederate conspiracy. He thought that Confederate President Jefferson Davis had ordered this killing to keep the Confederacy alive. When in essence, the reason Booth shot Lincoln, or even planned to kidnap him, is because he was feeling so guilty that he hadn't served the Confederacy. Okay? So, with this big reward out, within hours there were soldiers looking for Booth, there were law enforcement officials looking for Booth. Now, if a soldier or Booth found him, would they get the money? No, because that's their job. But you even had angry mobs out there looking for Booth, because who wouldn't want $100,000 or $1.5 million? Well, all of a sudden we were looking for somebody around here, and they were offering $1.5 million for his capture. I just might pack heat and go look for the guy. That's a lot of money. You just might do that, you know, if you thought you had the courage to do so. So within hours, you had soldiers and law enforcement officials and angry mobs combing the countryside in search of Booth. So we're going to talk about the night of the 14th of April, 1865, when we fled. He went across the Potomac River. He went into Maryland. He was with David Harold. They went to the boarding house to kind of regroup. When he leaves the boarding house, Booth tells the bartender that he shot Lincoln. In the meantime, Edwin Stanton's offered $100,000, and people are combing the countryside. Well, on the night of April 14th, guess whose home Booth and Harold come to? Guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dr. Samuel Mudd. So on the night of April 14th, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold arrive at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Why did they go there? They knew he was a doctor, and they knew he was from the South. Okay, he broke his leg, and they went to Booth to have Booth put a splint on the leg and fix his leg. And as soon as Booth did that, the two men left the Mudd residence. Now, your question would be, and this will come out later, did Mudd know it was John Wilkes Booth, the murderer of the president, that he fixed his leg? Was he a Southern sympathizer and that was his contribution to the assassination? Or was he an innocent bystander that a man come and wanted his leg fixed? He had no knowledge of who he was and fixed his leg. Well, we'll finish that conversation later when we get into the end of this. Well, after they left the Mudd residence, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold, for the next 6 days, simply camped out in a wooded swamp in Maryland. So after leaving Mudd's residence and getting his leg fixed, or at least splinted, for the next 6 days, Booth and Harold camped out in the wooded swamp area of Maryland. So they've been in D.C., they've been in Maryland. They're camping there in the swamp for 6 days. Well, on April 23rd of 1865, Booth and Harold cross into Virginia. They go into Virginia. Okay, on April 23rd of 1865, Booth and Harold cross into Virginia. And on April 24th, they arrive at the tobacco farm of Richard Garrett. So on the 23rd, they find themselves in Virginia, and on the 24th, they end up at the tobacco farm of Richard Garrett. And Garrett lets them, not knowing who they are, sleep in his barn that night. The night of the 24th, Booth and Harold are sleeping in Richard Garrett's barn. Well, early the next morning on April 25th, when they wake up, both Booth and Harold are cornered in that barn by the 16th New York Cavalry. So early the morning of April 25th, 1865, Booth and Harold find themselves cornered in this barn by the 16th New York Cavalry. How are they going to try to get him out? Because they want to take him alive, because they want to find out what Booth's motive was. Is this a Southern conspiracy? Is this a guy acting on his own? What? You know, you want to find out. Why in the world would you shoot the President of the United States? So how are they going to try to get him out? They're going to set the barn on fire, hoping to drive the men out. Well, when the barn was set on fire by the cavalry, David Harold came out immediately and surrendered. David Harold came out immediately and surrendered as soon as the barn was set on fire. John Wilkes Booth continued to resist capture and stayed inside the barn and was armed. Okay, was armed. So, David Harold's smart enough to figure out, this ain't working too good, I think I'll just surrender, take my chances. Booth refuses to surrender, stays in the barn, and he's still inside the barn and is armed. Well, these troops from the 16th New York Cavalry were given specific orders to take Booth alive. He was not to be killed. He was to be taken alive. That's the orders that the 16th New York Cavalry was given. Take the assassin alive. Unfortunately, Sergeant Boston Corbett silenced John Wilkes Booth for life. He's on your sheet. Boston Corbett. Excuse me. So the troops had orders to take Booth alive, but Sergeant Boston Corbett of the 16th New York Cavalry silences John Wilkes Booth for life. This is an interesting dude, this Boston Corbett. What happened is Corbett was watching Booth through the cracks in the barn. You know, they never get a barn tight, and there's cracks in the barn, and he's actually watching Booth through these cracks in the barn. And Booth was shifting in and out of Corbett's view with a gun in his hand. Okay? So this is Boston Corbett. He's looking through these slats, and he's seeing Booth, and he's coming in and out of his view, and Corbett can see that he has a gun in his hand. Well, the flames are getting higher and higher inside the barn and around the barn. And finally, Corbett raises his pistol, puts his sight on Booth, And even though the word from Washington was clear to take Booth alive, Corbett seemed to walk closer and closer to the fire, and he stopped just paces away from the barn. He watched Booth point his gun outside towards the Union troops and pulled the trigger on his pistol, hitting Booth through the neck, severing his vertebrae, leaving him paralyzed at the moment. So Corbett's watching him through the slats. Finally, he gets closer and closer to the flames in the barn. Booth comes out and points his pistol at Union troops. Corbett takes him down. Shoots him with his pistol, hits him in the neck. It'll sever his vertebrae, which will make him paralyzed at that point. Okay, he just instantly paralyzed. Well, once Corbett shot Booth, the soldiers dragged him from the barn and laid him on the porch of Garrett's home. Okay? So once Corbett shot Booth, leaving him paralyzed through the neck, severed his vertebrae, Union soldiers drug the wounded Booth from the barn and laid him up on Garrett's porch of his house. There he died, on the porch, at the age of 26. They had no confession out of him, no nothing. Never got to talk to him. So I'll repeat that again just so you do. So Corbett is watching Booth through the cracks in the barn as the assassin was shifting in and out of view with the gun in his hand. As the flames rose in and around the barn, Corbett trained his pistol on the image of Booth, even though the word from Washington was clear to take him alive. Corbett then walked closer to the fire and stopped just paces away from the barn. And as Corbett watched Booth point his gun outside towards Union troops, Corbett defied his orders, pulled the trigger on his pistol, hitting Booth through the neck, severing his vertebrae, leaving him paralyzed. Union soldiers then drug Booth from the barn, laid him on the porch of the Garrett home, where he died shortly afterwards at the age of 26. Well, what do you think your first question might be? No, they got him in custody. What might be your question if you're watching that whole thing, or if you're a superior officer? What might you say to Boston Corbett? Why'd you shoot and kill Booth, despite the orders from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to bring him in alive? I wish it was that simple. He simply said, quote, God wanted me to do it. That's what Boston Corbett told superior officers when asked, why in the world would you shoot and kill John Wilkes Booth after you were given specific orders from the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, to bring him in alive? His simple answer was, quote, God wanted me to do it. All right, now, I just got to tell you the story. It's a little off color, but it's history, so I want you to understand it.
Who wants to write?
Now, you don't really have to write this down, but I do want you to listen to it because it's an interesting story. Corbett was considered what we would call today a religious fanatic, overly religious. Here's why. Here's why he became so religious. At the age of 26, he even swore off liquor, which was not common in those days. And he grew his hair and a beard long because he wanted to style himself to look just like Jesus. True story. Okay? So at the age of 26, he swore off liquor, which was unusual. Most 26-year-old men were pretty good drinkers in those days. Swore off liquor, even grew his hair and a beard so he would look like Jesus Christ. He was baptized by a Methodist minister late in life, and he changed his first name to Boston. It was originally Thomas, in recognition of the town that saved him from the drink. Okay, it was in Boston where he decided to give up drinking, so he gets baptized by a Methodist minister and changes his name to Boston instead of Thomas to recognize the town that saved him from alcohol. In the summer of 1858, obviously prior to this assassination, he was ogled by a pair of prostitutes. You know what ogled means? Yeah, aroused. I guess would be the best way. They started putting the moves on him, and he got the feeling, so to speak, that he didn't want to have. And he was so guilty that he had responded, so to speak, to their come on, that he went home and took a pair of scissors and basically castrated himself. Honest to God, I mean, it's a little off color, but that's what the guy did. So he was a religious fanatic. He was ogled by a pair of prostitutes. He responded, if you know what I mean, to that. Got excited. He was so ashamed of that that he went home and took a pair of scissors and castrated himself. Honest to God, true story. Now, with that said, as off color it is, it's history, that's what he did, there's no question. So can you see why maybe he thought God told him to do it? He wasn't quite, he was too much of a religious fanatic and disobeyed his orders. And the sad thing about that is he silences the assassin of an American president. Yeah.
Wouldn't you have to have really good medical insurance?
Well,
Oh my God.
I don't even know, but my point, it wouldn't have been probably the thing to do, okay? But anyway, back, I do something, every year somebody says that. But anyway, now here's the serious part I want to get to. The sad thing about what he's done, because of his religious beliefs, that God wanted him to do it, is he silences the assassin of a president of the United States. So he will join, later in history, a fellow by the name of Jack Ruby. Everybody thinks Jack Ruby was the first ever to silence the assassin of a president of the United States. Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald, who killed President Kennedy. Nobody ever heard of it. Everybody, I mean, you go down the hall, or go uptown and say, hey, anybody know who Jack Ruby is? Everybody knows Jack Ruby, because in modern times, he killed Lee Harvey Oswald before Oswald could be brought to trial to find out what he was thinking when he shot President Kennedy. Boston Corbett beat him to the punch. He was the Jack Ruby of this time by killing Oswald, by killing Wilkes Booth, so we would never know what his motives were, okay? So, kind of an interesting story in general.
So we have no idea what his actual motives were.
Other than what I've told you from what we got from his diaries, because he kept diaries. Now, this is interesting, I want you to listen to this. Both Boston Corbett and Jack Ruby had things in common. They had the same legacy. Quote, not that of a hero, but that of one who would forever obstruct justice, obscure truth, and spawn conspiracy. That's what Boston Corbett and Jack Ruby have in common. They are not that of a hero, but that of one who would forever obstruct justice, obscure truth, and spawn conspiracy. Because there were conspiracy theories about the Lincoln assassination, not quite to the extent of the Kennedy assassination, but these guys ruined, both Corbett and Ruby, their actions cheated the American public from knowing the truth and motives surrounding the assassinations of two of the most popular presidents we've ever had, President Abraham Lincoln and President John F. Kennedy. Sad part in history. Okay, so anyway, that is the story of the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. Now, let's talk about the fate of these conspirators. What happened to these conspirators in the assassination of Lincoln and the attempted kidnapping, right? So we obviously know what happened to the head conspirator, right? John Wilkes Booth was shot by Boston Corbett and died on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse, okay? What about the rest of these people that were involved, okay? So within days of Booth's killing, these conspirators were arrested by the government, they were tried by a military court, and they were all found guilty. The question is, what will their sentence be, okay? So again, repeating that so you can get it in your notes. Within days of Booth's killing, the rest of these conspirators were rounded up. They were arrested, tried by a military court, and found guilty. So the next question is, once they were all found guilty, what happened to them? And I'll tell you, okay? Write it wherever you want. July 7th, 1865. Lincoln was killed on what day? April 14th. April, May, June, July. A little less than 3 months after the assassination, on July 7th of 1865, check these, write them down, whatever you think. George Atzerodt, David Harold, Lewis Powell, and Mary Surratt. George Atzerodt, David Harold, Lewis Powell, and Mary Surratt were hanged by the neck until dead in a public display to make examples of them. July 7th, 1865, George Atzerodt, David Harold, Lewis Powell, and Mary Surratt were hanged by the neck until dead in a public display to make examples of them. Now, Mary Surratt is an interesting point, and this will help you a little bit, Leilani. And you can always use my notes, you know, as one of your sources. There were 9 members of this military court. 5 of the 9 recommended to President Andrew Johnson to give Mary Surratt a life sentence rather than death because of her, quote, sex, being a female, and her age. 5 of the 9, would that be majority? Recommended, but whose final say is it? Recommended to President Andrew Johnson that she be given a life sentence in prison rather than be hung because of her sex, what they mean by that gender we call today, but her in fact she was a female and she was young.